Giant makes this continuing mistake of giving the microphone to a stockbroker in front of a target-rich audience like this. I'll do my best to resist what he's given me. Just one comment on the last speech. There's parts of my business, unfortunately, this year that have been turned into nonprofits, but I'll tell you, it wasn't through my intention. I guess it was my management that got it there. Then you'll understand exactly why nonprofits are so destructive. The next speaker, Adrian Day, mercifully has never presided over a nonprofit. I've known Adrian for 30 years. He has been a sterling investor and a sterling investment advisor. I have been with him through 30 years of the conference circuit, and I've always marveled at his teaching skills and his generosity. Of course, it's self-serving. If he teaches people well and they like the lessons, they might sign him up, they might give him some money, and he might make some money on their money. He is also, many people don't know this, but you are about to, extremely well-grounded in history. And unlike many people in the investment business, whose perception of the future is guided by their experience in the immediate, and by immediate I mean 7-second past, Adrian has the very sense to understand that while history doesn't always repeat, it often rhymes, which is why most of his clients have been with him for 10 or 20 years. You're going to get a history lesson, and you're going to get a history lesson in the context of liberty and freedom, because in addition to being successful in his vocation, this is capitalism and morality, his avocation. And with Adrian, you'll find that the vocation and the avocation are the same. Please welcome a great friend of mine and a great friend of liberty, Adrian Day.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rick, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. When Giant, who's a great friend of mine also, he sent me an email saying, if you have any suggestions on things we might want to talk about or how we can do it at the conference, do let me know. And I made the mistake of saying, it is the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. I don't see how we can have a conference on liberty without mentioning Magna Carta. So he said, great, you're on the program. Then a little bit after that, he said to me, now you do understand that the speakers, we don't want anything on politics, nothing on finance, we don't want anything on history. I said, anyway, so I'm going to give a little bit of a talk on Magna Carta, primarily looking at the myths that have grown up around Magna Carta. But first I need to ask, in very broad terms, for a show of hands, how many people here would say that they are reasonably familiar with Magna Carta and its impact? I don't mean you know every one of the clauses by heart. I mean just reasonably. Okay, and how many people would here would say they know virtually nothing about it? Oh dear. Oh my. Okay. Well, last month was the 800th anniversary of the signing of the Magna Carta. This is a big deal. The British Library, in addition to selling Magna Carta t-shirts and Magna Carta tea towels and mugs and inkwells, they're also selling a, quote, original 1215 Magna Carta British Library baby pacifier with the entire text in Latin on an orthodontic nipple. Now, the Magna Carta is sometimes called the Great Charter of Liberties, and we're frequently told that it laid the foundations of English common law. It inspired the American Declaration of Independence, and we're told that it spread the rule of law throughout much of the world. Some of that is true and some of it isn't. But I think there's a great deal of hyperbole about the Magna Carta and its significance. Lord Denning, you won't know him, but he's the greatest modern British jurist, he called it the greatest constitutional document of all times. So those of you who said you really don't know anything about it, you don't know anything about the greatest constitutional document of all times. UNESCO said it was the very first time that any constraints were put on the monarch or that there were any protections for the church. A chap called Daniel Hannan, a member of the European Parliament, said it was the most important bargain in the history of the human race. Runnymede, where it was signed, is the place where freedom was born. And one more, if I may, from America, Roosevelt. That's not the bad Roosevelt, that's the worst Roosevelt. He said that the democratic aspiration was written in Magna Carta. Well, apropos of Doug's speech, where's Doug? There he is. I think Roosevelt knew as little about the meaning of words, democracy, as he actually knew about history. I could go on, but I think you get the point. There are several myths about Magna Carta, and I just kind of want to demolish them. Freedom, the law, Parliament ruled by representative government, none of this was invented in 1215. I mean, the ancient Greeks had democracy. Hammurabi had a law code, 3 millennia before this. The laws of Solon, of Athens, proclaimed all men were equal before the law and could only be judged by a jury of their peers. None of this is new. And actually, it was very widespread in medieval law that the king was not above the law. So I think one question we here might ask ourselves, what did the libertarian yeoman of the 13th century think about the Magna Carta? He actually didn't think anything about it, because the Magna Carta was not at all a systematic exposition of freedom and rights. It wasn't like the American Declaration of Independence that proclaimed certain broad principles. It was really dealing with very, very practical issues, complaints of the time. And the complaints were the complaints of the barons against a particular king. So all these, no highfalutin phrases about liberty, and absolutely nothing of concern to ordinary people. Magna Carta talks about free men, but by free men it simply means the nobles. It doesn't mean yeomans, let alone serfs. I think it's also worth noting that the Magna Carta was written in Latin. And so the English peasantry didn't speak Latin, they spoke English, and so they couldn't even read it if they wanted to. And it talks about issues of sockage and burgage and scrutage and obsolete measurements. I mean, one of the clauses deals with a very practical issue and an important issue, but the rights of fishermen to dam and block rivers versus the rights of traders to move their ships around. That's an important issue, but it's hardly a ringing declaration of freedom. So I don't know if anybody here is familiar with a book, probably not, called 1066 and All That. It's a book that every English schoolboy knows. It's a kind of Blackadder guide to summary of English history. Are we familiar with Blackadder? Okay, it's a Blackadder summary of English history. And they discuss the Magna Carta. They say, number one, no one was to be put to death except the common people. Number two, everybody should be free except the common people, and so on. So, as I mentioned, the Magna Carta arose from a particular event at a particular time. A weak and tyrannical king, King John, who imposed taxes on his barons to fight wars in France just one too many times, and they said, well, we don't really want to go back and fight your war. So let's just look at some of the myths that have grown up about Magna Carta. I've already sort of discussed that it was by no means original or the first. I've already discussed or mentioned that there were no broad discussions of freedom. I think the other thing that's important is that it wasn't special. There were many, many charters. Charters were a very common thing in the medieval period. A charter being a pact between a king and his subjects, again, normally the nobles, over a particular issue. Sometimes they were regional charters. So you had the king travel to Ipswich about a month before the Magna Carta, and you had the Charter of Ipswich proclaimed, which gave rights to the people in Ipswich. But if we just look at 1215 was the Magna Carta. We had a charter in April of 1213 in Brinkley. We had a charter in London in August 1213. We had a charter in Bury St Edmunds in July 1214. And we had the Magna Carta in Runnymede in 1215. There was nothing, June 1215. There was nothing special about it at the time. At the time, nobody thought this was unusual. And the Magna Carta was indeed immediately ignored by both sides. It was actually annulled by the Pope. That's a long story we don't have time to get into. No cases were ever brought against the king for breaching clauses in the Magna Carta. So why has it taken on this great aura and this great mythology to the people who know about it and to FDR? Well, the charter was actually reissued a few years later, 10 years later, and that's when it acquired the name Magna Carta. Now, Magna Carta sounds grand, right? A big charter. But it was called a Magna Carta simply to avoid confusion with another charter, which was a shorter one. So it's called a Magna Carta purely because of its length, the big charter, as opposed to the little charter. It has nothing to do with the greatness of the rights that are allegedly protected. I think it's also important to say, as English people, when we're kids, we learn about the Magna Carta and English common law, we call it English common law, and how it's spread throughout the world, and this is wonderful. But in many other countries at the time, there were similar kinds of charters or oaths taken by kings to protect the rights of the people. In Germany, King Conrad, this was in the 11th century, 2 centuries before the Magna Carta. He promised that he would not take land except according to the constitution of our ancestors, according to the law, and according to the judgment of peers. So this was nothing new in the Magna Carta at all. A century and a half later, Edward III introduced something that he called the Six Statutes. It took some things from the Magna Carta, introduced others, but the most important revision that he made in 1354 was he replaced the word freeman and specified that no man of whatever estate or condition he may be enjoyed these various rights, couldn't be imprisoned without lawful judgment, had to have a judgment of his peers and habeas corpus and so on. So that was really the important thing. That's what we should really celebrate when these rights were spread from nobles to basically everybody. One more thing before we, before I get to the conclusion. And that is that soon after this, the Magna Carta was basically forgotten. In the 14th, 15th, and in the early part of the 16th century, you could mention Magna Carta and nobody would know what you're talking about. It was just not a meaningful thing. It was totally ignored. And it was only in the 1620s and 30s, in the growing battle between the English Parliament and the Stuart kings, which led eventually to the beheading of Charles I, and the interregnum with Oliver Cromwell. It was only then that someone rediscovered Magna Carta and took it up essentially as a propaganda, a piece of propaganda against the king. And at that, Charles I actually forbade publication of the Magna Carta and of any mention of the Magna Carta. But 20 years before that, nobody had heard of it. Nobody knew what it was. It became a pure piece of propaganda And that's when all the myths really grew up about it. Oliver Cromwell, who in my view is one of the most evil rulers that England's ever had, he called it the Magna Carta. And the petition of right, you know what's coming, he called the petition of shite. So there's also a claim that this was the first time, or this was important in the origin of Parliament, in the origin of a representative government, and that is just extremely flimsy, or it's worse than flimsy. First of all, we should say that what was in the Magna Carta was a discussion of a council of barons. So we're talking about the House of Lords, nothing to do with the House of Commons, nothing to do with representative democracy. But in there's a magisterial book called The History of the House of Lords in the Middle Ages, written by an English politician called Enoch Powell, and he talks about, well, the development of the House of Lords in the Middle Ages, and 1215 gets about 2 paragraphs. It's just not important. You had the development of Parliament before in its very rudimentary stages, all the way through to the middle of the 19th century, where we basically have the Parliament we have today. But 1215 was just a blip on the chain. If we hadn't had that battle between Parliament and the kings in the Stuart age, we probably wouldn't be remembering Magna Carta today. So, you know, just a couple more things, if I may, before I wrap up. I said to Giant, you know, but I thought in the context of this conference, 10 minutes on the Magna Carta was probably enough. And can I paraphrase? I think he said that I've heard you can't say anything in 10 minutes, Adrian, so I got a little bit more. I think there are some issues that do resonate. Certainly, there are some issues that do resonate today, but they're not the first time they were expounded, and it wasn't unique to England either. One is that no freeman can be taken, imprisoned, outlawed, banished, or in any way destroyed, except by the lawful judgment of his peers and by the law of the land. That's an important principle. And another important principle which led to habeas corpus is that to no one can we sell, we being the king, to no one can we sell, or to no one can we deny, to no one can we delay justice. That's a pretty important principle. There was also the principle that the church should be free from state interference. To the feminists in the room, Magna Carta also gave the right for widows not to marry again if they chose to live without a husband. Now, so I've sort of talked a little bit about how Magna Carta took on this myth in England. It also was taken up by the colonists in America who, as I think we all know, the colonists basically said they had the same rights as other Englishmen. That's where the dispute originally arose, that people in the colony had the same right, or colonies, had the same rights as people in England. And they talked about those rights as they were enshrined in Magna Carta. And it became a bit of a rallying cry with many of the colonists who were fighting against England. In 1770, the state of Massachusetts sent instructions to Franklin, who at that time was the envoy to Britain trying to negotiate to include the colonies in the rights of the Magna Carta. And 5 years later, Massachusetts, I don't know if you've looked at their state seal, but Massachusetts, their state seal has a picture of a man with a sword in one hand and a scroll, which is the Magna Carta, in the other hand. And in the years after the Declaration of Independence, 16 states in the US actually incorporated the entire text of the Magna Carta into their state constitutions. I don't know if people know that. Another 25 incorporated various passages not into their constitution, into their statute books. And the Magna Carta, as you probably know, is pictured on the door of the Supreme Court of the US. So in the US, it's actually taken on a much longer lasting and much more grandiose mythology than even in England. But I think one thing it did do, which is important, I've mentioned some of the rights it enumerated, not for the first time in history, not in the only place in history, but some of the rights it enumerated, which are pretty powerful. But I think for English people and English-speaking people, it kind of created a narrative of freedom. It became an iconic document. And so even though it's a myth, perhaps myths can be valuable in building a cultural identity for people, for protecting liberties, but it is still essentially a myth. That's all I have to say on that subject.
We have time for a couple of quick questions.
It sounds as if I believe the Magna Carta has been accorded undue glory. Are there any documents that have been overlooked or underappreciated? Do you have an opinion?
Oh. Yeah, that's a very good question. Did everybody heard the question? You know, I think the Bill of Rights, which we had in England, you mean, or just generally? Anywhere. Well, I mean, I mentioned a couple of examples like the Laws of Solon, which, you know, lay out some very clear fundamental rights. And you can see this in many countries around the world. And there's documents, excuse me, I just don't know them off the top of my head, the names. But, you know, 2.5 millennia before Magna Carta, there were similar kind of documents enumerating rights in China as well as in India. So, yeah, it was by no means unique, and I think there are many documents that are undervalued or overlooked. Yes.
Hans Hoppe wrote a book called Democracy, the God That Failed, in which he favored monarchy on the ground that the monarch has a longer time horizon, whereas the Democratic president can only make hay for 4 or 8 years or something. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, well, I agreed with everything he had to say about what was wrong with democracy. But I guess everybody knows Winston Churchill's famous quip about democracy is the worst form of government except for every other one. That was a quip, by the way, so you meant to laugh. Thank you. You know, I mean, the obvious problem with monarchy, you know, particularly the more absolute forms of monarchy, is that you're dependent upon, you know, a particular individual. And as 1066 and all that said, King John was a bad man. And so when you have a bad man, you know, bad things happen. So that's a much bigger topic, Walter. I think you should talk about that. I did want to make one comment, if I may, on Doug's speech, and I know you'll excuse me about this, Doug. Yeah, I know you will. But when you're talking about defining your terms and using accurate terms and so on, everybody misuses lowest common denominator, when what they really mean is the highest common factor.